Hi there, this is Andy, and I'm going to be looking at the motion. This House believes that social movements should actively mobilize anger in their political advocacy. So I'm going to start by looking at some of the words and phrases in the motion and the context of the motion, and then look at some of the ideas for both sides. So, starting off with the context, I think one of the things you need to do in this debate is to ask yourself a couple of questions about what social movements are and how they achieve their goals through political advocacy. So that will help you build arguments on both sides. So if we think about what is a social movement, a social movement is a movement that seeks to make society a better place, probably a fairer place, um, often fighting for social justice, although not necessarily. Um, and that implies a couple of things. First of all, it implies an injustice in the status quo. And when there is injustice, then the job of the social movement is to draw attention to this injustice and to raise awareness of that injustice. But that requires people in society more generally not just to know about what's going on, but also to care about what's going on. So if you're a movement that's anti-racism, for example, um, your job isn't necessarily so much to raise awareness of racism because that's something everybody knows about, but to make the general public aware of specific instances or circumstances where racism manifests itself, and then to care about or to get angry about those situations so that a solution may be found. I think the other thing to bear in mind about social movement is that successful social movements are movements. In other words, they are collections of people who have come together and are trying to move in a certain direction. And that, again, requires people to care about your issue. It requires buy-in. It requires people who are committed to the cause. And that's all important when it comes to the cases, particularly the proposition side, but of both sides. The other thing that I would draw attention to in the motion is the words actively mobilize. So what this means is that you're not just talking in proposition about social movements using or benefiting from people's anger, because that's a very soft or weak case. If you're just saying, well, social movements should take advantage of the fact that people are angry about racism to try and do something about it, then that becomes an almost unrebuttable case. It's almost truistic. The question here is whether social movements should actively go out and mobilize. In other words, really try to make people feel angrier about something in order to achieve their goals. And I think if you're on the pro side in this debate, you should try and lean into that burden. And you should try and say that, yeah, I mean, social movements should go out and try and rile people up. They should, get in their faces and say, you should be angry about this because this is terrible. I think this is one of those debates where probably taking a firm, hard line is going to help you. Let me give you an example, right? A few years ago, when the flood of refugees from the Syrian civil war into neighboring countries and into Europe was at its height, there was a picture carried in newspapers and the news media all around the world of a young Syrian boy, only I think 3 years old or 4 years old, whose body had been washed up on a beach as his family were trying to flee to safety. And that picture shocked people around the world. And that picture led to huge increases in fundraising for refugee charities and to a lot of discussion and discourse about what needed to be done to help solve the refugee crisis. Now, in that case, some charities were accused of using shock tactics by using that sort of imagery in their advertising. But their defense was that people are dying like that every day, young and old, and it requires charities, it requires advocacy organizations to put that image in people's faces and say, look, this is what's happening. You cannot remain silent. You cannot remain passive. You have to do something to help. And if the consequences of those shock tactics are that more people's lives are saved and more people manage to make it to safety in Europe or wherever else they might have gone, then the ends justify the means. So try and lean into your burden in the debate and try and, argue not just for using or benefiting from anger, but that social movement should actively try and mobilize and stoke up the anger. Um, I think the other thing you can maybe think about during prep time is the nature of anger itself. What do we mean by anger? And all I'll say at this point is, anger is a kind of visceral reaction, but it's a two-edged sword, right? Anger, can obviously be a powerful emotion for good or ill, and that's just something that's worth thinking about because it's going to inform arguments on both sides of this debate. So if we look at the pro side in today's debate, I think that the basic outline of the argument of pro is probably fairly straightforward. Anger is what motivates people to do things, to give money, to put their lives on the line in extreme situations, to put their comfort on the line in less extreme situations. So obviously this debate could take place in the context of, an extreme situation like you're protesting for human rights in a dictatorship which might lock you up and kill you for doing so. But also I think more everyday situations hopefully pertain in most of the countries that we're watching this from, where going out on a march or donating money or donating your time or writing to your local representative or starting a social media campaign are some of the ways in which you might try and change your society for the better. But we're all busy people. You have school and exams, or people have jobs, they have families. To motivate people to step out of their comfort zone, to risk their job, or to risk their friendships with other people, or just to have materially less comfortable lives than they otherwise might have. That's something which is hard to do without getting people angry. That's not to say it's impossible. Obviously, there are plenty of people who fight against injustice, I should say, because from an intellectual point of view, they understand that it's bad for society to be deeply unequal or whatever. But in many ways, it's anger that's going to be the most powerful motivator for many people. And therefore, social movements should try and actively mobilize that, because it's going to motivate more people to do more things in support of that movement. I think anger probably also motivates you to carry on when you may not see much change going on. One of the problems with advocacy, and perhaps one of the reasons why the passion of young people often burns out into the kind of moderate centrism of old people like me, is because as you get older, you've seen things before, right? And you can easily become disillusioned and think, well, things don't really change very much. Anger can motivate you to keep going, even though you may think that society is still deeply unequal or getting worse, or there's more racism, more anti-Semitism, whatever it might be. One's reminded of the classic quote from Martin Luther King: "The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice." Right? That was really a way of saying to his supporters, look, this is going to take a long time. We're trying to effect social change on a kind of historical timeline. But bear with me and trust me, because eventually the arc of history is going to bend towards a more just society, even if it takes our entire lifetimes or beyond, which in his case, obviously, it did. I think another thing that you can argue on the pro side is that in the modern world, particularly when we see images from all around the world, we get news from every continent and every walk of life delivered instantly to our phones and to our screens. It's very hard to, there's a lot of injustice in the world. There are a lot of bad things happening at any given time. And in order to make people care about your issue and the injustice that you are fighting against, you need to somehow rise above the crowd, right? There's inequality in my country. There's inequality in neighboring countries. There's inequality around the world. Why should I care more about this particular instance of inequality? People on, short-term contracts in my country often don't have as much job security as they used to have 30, 40 years ago. That's bad. Am I angry about it? Well, there's lots of other bad things happening in the world. In order to successfully mobilize people to care about your issue, you need to give them a reason to care more about your issue than other issues. That's just the way it is. There's so many things crowding onto people's time. People have limited time to address those things, to go out and do something. They have limited money to donate. So mobilizing anger is a way to get people to prioritize your cause over other causes. And that may seem like a kind of cold-hearted way of looking at it, but that's what social movements exist to do. They exist to say, we need to deal with this problem. Yes, there are lots of other problems, but we want to focus on this one. We want you to get mad about this, because that's the way we're going to change it. Now, you have to be careful here, because opposition, I think, could argue that that this is a double-edged sword again. This idea of what we sometimes call compassion fatigue. Like, people are just get tired of having to care about so many different things in the world, and they, there's a well-established phenomenon where, after people have been giving money to, disaster relief and emergencies and so on, obviously the amount of money coming in, the number of donations falls over time, and it's quite hard to then rouse people to dip into their pockets again and give more money, because they're just tired of caring about everything, and they feel like they've done their best and they don't have the bandwidth emotionally to deal with everything that's happening in the world. So I think the opposition could argue that trying to constantly rile people up and get them angry could be counterproductive, because it leads to a lot of important causes being sidelined and being forgotten about. We can come back to that when we talk about the opposition. I think other things you can say on the pro side probably would be, arguably mobilizing anger maybe helps you to build coalitions and build solidarity. Remember, we're talking about here about social movements, which implies kind of large collections of people trying to move society towards a certain place. So if people are angry about one injustice, maybe it stands to reason that they're more likely to care about other injustices as well, right? Maybe you by playing on people's emotions, then you're more likely to be able to cause solidarity among other groups, arguably. I think the last thing I would say on the pro side, and this is quite important, is going back to the idea of how do social movements successfully advocate for change? What is the theory of change that social movements need to use in order to affect improvements in society? And I think if we're talking about legislative change, if we're talking about pushing politicians to act, to pass a law to outlaw certain kinds of discrimination or more funding for welfare, whatever it might be, politicians generally are more likely to act when people are angry about things, because that's when politicians start to get nervous about their jobs at the next election. So just to take an example, a few months ago in the United States of America, there was the Supreme Court passed down a decision that effectively ended the constitutional guarantee of the right to abortion in the United States. So some states have moved to outlaw abortion in the wake of that decision. That led to a huge surge in support for the Democratic Party over the summer of 2022, as a lot of people, particularly young people, particularly women, extremely angry that the Republican Party, as they saw it, were trying to take away their rights and their freedom to choose what to do with their body. One thing that's interesting is that as I record this in late October 2022, the Republican Party is now creeping back in the polls, and the speculation is that the Republicans may win the midterm elections in November 2022. The reason being that people's anger is starting to fade, right? It's not because the issue is becoming less serious, but that anger is sort of wearing off to some extent. And with it, perhaps some of the political pressure to do something about this issue after the midterm elections, if that becomes possible. Obviously, we'll see what happens in early November 2022. But the point is that it's not enough for people intellectually to understand that something is good or bad or for or against their interests. In order to really move the needle in terms of affecting political change, you need people to be angry about it, angry enough that it pushes that issue towards the top of the issues that people care about when they go to the polls, and therefore causes politicians to respond to that either in positive ways by voting for legislation, or even in kind of negative ways by at least persuading politicians on the other side of an issue that it's in their interest to compromise, or it's in their issues to not push the positions maybe they've been pushing in the past. So anger is really vital in keeping an issue at the top of the political agenda, making it more likely that you're going to effect change. If we think about the opposition side of this debate, I think there's a number of ways you can look at this. I think one is to just to use the Yoda saying, anger leads to hatred and violence and bad things. It leads to the dark side. Anger can lead to unpredictable consequences, whether that's violent protest, whether it's hatred of the other side, whatever it might be. Now, the question of whether violent protest can be justified in social movements is a separate issue, perhaps, although it might come up in this debate. But the point here is that anger is harder to control. So it may cause supporters to say and do things that they might not, the leadership of that movement might not want them to do. And if you think about your life, if you think about examples when you've been angry, you can see this is obviously true. Like, it causes you to do things you might regret or say things that you don't mean. It causes you to kind of lose your rationality a little bit. So you might be looking for revenge against somebody that you don't like. And that kind of takes over. It takes over your life for a short period, whether it's an hour or a day or a week, whatever it might be. And that, in the context of a social movement, is dangerous. Because the impact of that is that the movement maybe loses message discipline, right? So you have, let us say, a movement protesting against police brutality, right? So your movement might have a set of very clear goals of what it wants to achieve in terms of reforming policing in a particular country. But if you have supporters who are going beyond that and saying, cops should be, you should shoot cops when you see them, for example, or something like that, then that can be dangerous, because that can cause a cycle of escalation, both rhetorical and also potentially in terms of violent retaliations against police, which in turn would just worsen the situation. It can also alienate moderate opinion, right? So a lot of people who perhaps would back the message that policing needs to be reformed wouldn't necessarily back the message that all cops are bastards, quote unquote, which is a famous slogan of the police reform movement over the last couple of years in the United States. And that's a bad thing, because most social change doesn't necessarily come through revolution. It comes through a political process. It comes through a process of discussion. It comes through a process of voting. It requires you to galvanize majorities in favor of your political position. And the way to do that isn't necessarily harsh rhetoric and harsh tactics and the stoking of anger, but trying to persuade people to your position, even if it takes longer, even if it's sometimes in danger of diluting the message that you want to put across. So I think on the opposition side, even if you were to concede that anger might raise the chances of politicians caring about an issue or voters caring about an issue, I think what you would argue is it lowers the chances of actually acting on that, because it's going to lead to more polarization. It gives people on the other side an excuse to deflect from the main issue that you're talking about, and instead sort of caricature the supporters of your movement as extreme, as unpatriotic, whatever it might be. So, again, to use the example of police brutality, what people on the Republican side in the argument would do is they would focus on the kind of craziest things that are being said by people in the reform movement, to argue that the average citizen would be less safe if the police are defunded, or that police are there to protect the citizens. Yes, there are problems, but we don't need to go so far as to defund the police, to get rid of police forces. That's going far too far. Instead, why don't we accept the status quo, because it's much better than the chaos that's being proposed by these angry radicals on the left. So I think that from the opposition, the argument that anger makes it harder to achieve what you're trying to achieve, even if it boosts your own supporters and boosts the morale of people who are in the movement, it lowers the impact of those of that advocacy and of those protests, because it makes it less likely that people are going to support you. Because when you're getting angry about something, then the people on the other side will tend to get angry as well. And we see polarization in many countries, right? Because inevitably you're kind of, you're super angry about something when people don't rouse themselves out of their beds to do something about it, when they don't donate to you, when they don't support the policy change you're arguing for, then the natural reaction is to get angry with them, right? Why don't you support us? Don't you care about the environment? Don't you care about Black lives? Don't you care about Syrian refugees? And if you don't, then you're my enemy. And, that is not necessarily, from the opposition point of view, that is not necessarily the way in which you're going to achieve meaningful change. I think another thing you can talk about, to go back to this idea of compassion fatigue that we talked about earlier, is, it makes it difficult if you are a charity or you're a social movement, or you're an advocacy movement who is trying to effect change. Anger is something which it's kind of hard to sustain on a permanent basis. I mean, if you think about people who live their lives constantly angry, that's not a very nice way to live your life. It must be exhausting to be constantly angry about everything. Most people hopefully have a limited reservoir of anger within themselves, or at least, not something that's going to burn for months and months and years of their lives. One hopes. And so the problem is that if your movement is based on people getting angry about things, then it's something that can burn out, right? Whereas if your advocacy is based on a more dispassionate, less emotional analysis of the facts, if you want people to try and enact policies which reduce inequality in society, not because they're mad about it, but because the evidence shows that inequality leads to these particular outcomes, all of which are undesirable, because we believe that people have the right to live in dignity, they have the right to, a comfortable life, and the state needs to help them to do that if they're unable to do it themselves. And that is something which remains true long after I cease to be angry about it. I'm now angry about something else instead. So rather than having to constantly kind of be involved in a kind of arms race with other advocacy movements and other social movements, trying to raise people to greater and greater levels of anger, then it might be a healthier model to try and persuade people on the merits of your case, rather than constantly having to stoke fury. Because what will you do when a new injustice comes along? What will you do when a different refugee crisis comes? Now you have to tell people, we told you that was the worst thing in the world. We told you had to get mad. Well, guess what? Now you have to get madder. That's not necessarily a recipe for long-term political advocacy. So I think that in this debate, as in all debates, a lot of it comes down to impacts. Which side of the debate ultimately is going to better affect social change in the long term? And how does emotion and anger and passion play into those impacts? So I think, in this debate, whichever side you're on, the key to winning the debate is really, well, our side, we get more impacts in terms of social improvements because of the analysis that I've just given, right? So don't lose sight of the impacts. And this is a debate which can get very messy, because you have people like dueling characterizations about what it means to be angry or what it means to mobilize anger in your political advocacy. So it's very easy to get kind of bogged down in little sort of side quests in this debate. Don't lose sight of the main thing. The main thing in any debate about social movements, or almost any debate, is whichever side can better achieve social change will win the debate, right? So keep that in your mind all the way through, and you'll have a decent chance of winning. Okay? And keep an eye on the US midterms. We'll see if I was right or not. Bye-bye.